Darwin said it accounts for. Okay, let's move on. The grand gaping hole in the theory of evolution. Look at this. Again, this is Dr. Douglas Axe, PhD in biochemistry, saying this. It's not just some guy off the street, but Dr. Axe is a professional scientist, and he says evolutionary theory ascribes inventive power to natural selection alone. However, because selection can only home in on the fitness signal from an invention, after that invention already exists, it can't actually invent. It cannot and does not invent anything. You must have something already created for selection to select on and allow the organism fitness to adapt to its environment. That just does not happen on its own. Okay? That is a serious problem. Now, let's go ahead and move on. Conclusions about natural selection. And then I'm going to give you some real evidence of design coming up here, so try to stay awake out there. Conclusion about natural selection. Natural selection adds no new information. In fact, it actually reduces by selecting things in the system that don't function the way they're supposed to. It weeds that out. So the fact that it weeds that out and there's less information with time is the opposite direction that it has to go if we can explain the origin of living things by natural selection. To get to macroevolution, you must have a way to add new information, not just to select from it. But natural selection cannot account for the origin of life or the origin of information. So it does not explain those things. Natural selection is a bait and switch from small-scale selection of existing traits that allow for an organism or population to conservatively track their environment. But the real question, what is the origin of the information content in living organisms? Well, we strongly infer, and I will show strong evidence coming up in just a few minutes, that intelligent design, the God of the Bible, is the one that made all this. He says he's the one that made all this. The Bible clearly states that God cannot lie. So if he didn't make it all, then he's a liar, but the Bible says he can't lie, so that's impossible. So then, if that's true, we just throw the Bible away. But don't do that, because it's proven true. And what I found through many years of study archaeologically, prophetically, and historically, the Bible confirms itself over and over and over again as being truthful and accurate. No other book fulfills prophecy the way the Bible does. Hundreds of prophecies for the future that always come true exactly the way it says. How is that possible unless this really is the Word of God? Okay, let's move on then. There's only really one other mechanism. I don't care what evolutionists say. They may come up with all kinds of different ideas and new systems and new ways to look at evolution. But the Neo-Darwinian theory of evolution that's proposed and accepted by all modern evolutionists has only two tenets to it. The first one, natural selection. We saw that that can do nothing for the origin of organisms or, explaining things like DNA, the origin of life, the origin of matter. It has no effect on any of those. It's helpless to do that. All it can do is edit. So what they say is the only other and real mechanism that does cause actual change is mutations. And we all think of mutations as, a guy with 3 heads or something like that. And so we don't ever think of mutations in a positive way. Mutations, what are they? They're changes in the genetic information of an organism. Mutations are thought to introduce new genetic information into a population by modifying genes already present in the genomes. Excuse me, Professor, it modifies genes in the genome, but where did the genome come from? They never tell you that because they cannot, with the Neo-Darwinian system, explain the origin of the genome. It's not explained. You can't get mutations unless it already exists. Whoops. It is acknowledged by evolutionists that most mutations are harmful. Nobody has a problem with that. They're called diseases that we see. I actually had someone argue with me the other day who said, look, we have examples of positive mutations. What about sickle cell anemia?
Poppycock.
Did you say sickle cell anemia? You're aware that that's classified as a disease? Look it up in the dictionary, Google it. It'll say the disease of sickle cell anemia. It has a beneficial effect in one small area where there's malaria, but it doesn't explain molecules to man evolution. And tell that to the African American people here in the United States that suffer from sickle cell anemia, which is an odd sickle shape to their blood cells, and many of them pass away from that. It is a disease. That certainly is not how things evolve. Occasionally, mutations, though, are thought to result in new variable characteristics. Well, let's determine whether that's actually true. NeoDarwinian theory of evolution says that natural selection operating on positive mutations through time produces pawn to scum people. Pawn scum to people evolution, okay? Or molecules to men evolution, those kind of macro changes. When somebody tries to tell you about small, tiny little variations, you know, Darwin's finches or the peppered moth, that's not what we're talking about. They must produce macro evolutionary changes. Can they do that? Well, let's find out. How about the types of mutations? I'm going to go through this very quickly. You need some background information in order to get to the point where we're going to make our major points in the presentation. There's different types of point mutations. Different types of mutations. The first one is a point mutation. These are mutations where one base changes. The result can be things like this HGPS, which is a very deadly syndrome. Inversions, an inversion of a mutation where a strand of DNA in a particular segment, it has a reversal in it. Example of that, hemophilia. Notice that all of these changes in the genetic code cause diseases, not improvements. Insertion mutations, segments, where a single base pair, you understand in the DNA there's these base pairs, A matches with T, C with G, or extensive link that is inserted into the DNA strand. These result in proteins that are lost. Well, folks, you have hundreds of proteins in your body, and every one of them does important functions. When those are lost, obviously that's a deleterious or harmful effect. Deletions in the mutations. Deletion mutations, segments of DNA in a single base pair, A and T or C and G, or extensive links that are deleted from the strand. Muscular dystrophy is one of the diseases that results. So in all these changes, I don't think I saw one that really improved by mutation organisms. And Dr. John Sanford has a book out called the Origin of the Genome. Okay, the Origin of the Genome. He's come out with a new edition to that. I highly recommend everybody look at that. He says, look, we find every generation has more and more deleterious genes in it, and the genome is weighing us down, so that only in a few thousand years the genome will be so corrupt that DNA won't be successfully produced. And Dr. Sanford knows what he's talking about, PhD, Cornell University. Okay, let's move on. Now, types of mutations continue. So frame shifts are another one. These are really very, very harmful movements of the DNA where they're out of sequence. And in those particular cases, very, very harmful. Now, I'm going to talk more about a critique of mutations. If mutations truly are the driving force of evolution that natural selection selects on to cause changes, we're in real trouble, folks, because what we see is that at least the vast majority of mutations are severely harmful, and even the ones that are proposed to be any kind of positive change never get us to molecules to men. Nothing new, almost never added to the DNA or creates new body parts. Mutations actually involve a loss or corruption of existing information. That's the direction mutations go. When evolutionists are asked to show an example of novel genetic information or body organs created by mutations, they can only show cases of a loss of or corruption of existing information. Never a case where there's a mutation and it's a positive mutation that enhances the genome. They never can show that. But let's take a look at some of their examples so you see what I'm talking about. So wingless beetles. It's a loss of information. They're not able to fly. It does confer a beneficial mutation because they're not blown out to sea. Say if there's an island somewhere, they lose the ability to fly. Well, that's a loss in information, causes a beneficial mutation because they don't get blown out to sea and die. But that's going the wrong direction. It's a loss of information. Flightless cormorants, the same exact thing, a loss of information that may allow the organism's survivalship, but not molecules to min evolution. Blind cave creatures, well, in that case, it's a conservation of the energy. They don't need as much energy using the organ of vision, and so that is lessened, okay? But that's going the wrong direction also. This is not evidence of macroevolution, molecules to man. It's actually a mutation that allows benefit. They use less information or less apparatus, but it doesn't take you from molecules to man. So evolution, natural selection, and mutation are a magician that is all hat and no rabbit. Okay, you get the point. And I love that quote. I just had to have that in there. Okay, and so let's go ahead and move on. So what can we say about the vast majority of mutations? They are deleterious or harmful. The cause of mutations can be both external, addition from, for example, additional radiation from the sun or from space. These are harmful. Or internal types of substances like toxins. All of these appear every day in the environment that we live in. They cause these types of mutations or changes in the genetic code. They're almost always deleterious. However, even though beneficial mutations do not seem to exist, there are some beneficial outcomes in specific environments only. But as soon as they get in a generalized environment, those traits are less enhanced and competition works against those organisms. So that cannot be the way that things actually evolve. Mutations seem only to alter current genetic information and not create or add new information. It is not the mechanism needed. And they know this, but they don't have anything else, so they keep propping it up and saying, well, we think it did it somehow, we don't know. By decreasing genetic information, some mutations in a specific environment then can be beneficial. But this is, I gave examples of that, but this is nothing to do with molecules to men evolution. It does not explain the origin of information, the origin of life, or the origin of matter. So it cannot and is not the answer for where we come from. Now, the vast majority of mutations then are extremely harmful. But there's a few examples that the evolutionists think, and I'm going to gloss over these very quickly, show evidence of positive mutations. One of them is nylon-degrading bacteria. So nylon material only came into existence back in the 1930s, and we know that this particular bacteria is actually able to degrade or digest that material. And so is that an example of a positive mutation? No, because the specificity of the bacteria is influenced in a negative way. It no longer has the specificity that it had before. Yeah, it's able to eat bacteria, but it is not as fit as it was before it was able to do that. So that's going the wrong direction according to Anderson and Purdom, both people that work in the area of genetics. How about this one? This is one the evolutionists always say, bacterial resistant. Starts with bacteria though and ends with a bacteria. So that is not macroevolution. We didn't get from something simplistic and evolve that up to, say, an elephant or something. So there are strains of bacteria that Richard Lenski has worked with, and bacteria produce incredibly quickly, so that by 2014, they had grown over 60,000 new generations. However, no new complex systems. It's the wrong kind of change. It's not molecules to men. He started with a bacteria and produced bacteria. That is not macroevolution or molecules to men evolution. A couple more points on the vast majority of mutations being deleterious. Bacterial changes may be beneficial in certain controlled environments. Okay? But that doesn't show molecules to men. And once those begin to compete with other bacteria outside of those controlled environments, the other bacteria are better fit and outproduce the ones that have some beneficial mutations in a controlled environment. So no matter what, even if you argue that that shows evolution, it doesn't go from a bacteria to any other kind of organism. It's simply a bacteria that may be more fit in a certain environment. That's not molecules to men. Both Douglas Axe, working with proteins, and Michael Behe, working with malaria in his book, The Edge of Evolution, have argued strongly that mutations cannot explain the complexity of life. Mutations must be combined step by step to produce macroevolution, but science does not confirm this. So it is not the mechanism by which things have evolved. And that's the only two mechanisms that Neo-Darwinism has. It doesn't have any other mechanisms. Neither is either, and they both can't be both. So natural selection cannot account for the origin of complex systems. It cannot invent complex structures, but acts as a conservative mechanism that allows organisms to adapt or track their environment. Mutations, then, thought to be the driving force of evolution, cannot explain complex biological structures. Almost all mutations are deleterious. Those that are beneficial seem to act by reduction of information. So it's said to be addition by subtraction, you could say, that are beneficial seem to act to reduce information, not an upward increase in information. If evolution is true, we should see constant positive mutations being step by step selected for as organisms get more complex through time. But this is not the case. So now we're at this point where we've critiqued and shown that Neo-Darwinism, the current theory of evolution, and it's supposed to be the best one that they've come up with after 150 years of looking at Darwinism, the Neo or New Darwinism that looks at all these studies and so forth, and that's the best that they can come up with. There really isn't any other naturalistic explanation. Has some severe problems, but that's not good enough to just say that there are problems. We have to show a better case and a better model than what they show, and we do. So let's take a look at the bacterial flagellum. Most of you are familiar with, who's heard of this before? Raise your hand, please. Most of you have. So you know the basic information. I'm going to skim through this very quickly. There's a rotary motor. That's what Michael Behe calls it. It's an outboard motor. It propels bacteria through water. That's what it does. And it's said by Behe to be the equivalent of an outboard motor, like the kind we use in boats. It propels them very quickly for their body size. We can't actually see them, so they're so tiny, but we can see them in microscopes. Consists of 40 different parts of proteins, including a rotor, stator, bushing, drive shaft, clamps, hooks, propellers, U-joints, and transduction. That's electricity flowing through it from one location to another. It can spin. The flagellar motor can spin up to 100,000 RPMs in only 1/4 of a quarter turn, reverse itself, and go the opposite direction. This was what Behe says in his book way back in the 1990s. It's so small that the human eye cannot see them without a microscope. 40 nanometers, or in a term you can understand, 5/1,000,000ths of a centimeter. So we can't see it with our eyes. We can see it easily with microscopes and electron microscopes. Tiny, tiny things. So Behe said, look, this is an irreducibly complex system. Okay? That was the state of things back in the 1990s. Now, in addition, it has a self-assembly, and it's water-cooled. It's a water-cooled rotary engine. Amazing complexity. Hardwired single transduction system with short-term memory. Okay? It's able to remember how to build itself a particular way, have all this complex machinery. That is the point. All 40 parts, proteins, need to be in position for the flagella to function. It is considered by Behe to be an irreducibly complex system. That's what he argued for back in the 1990s. He still argues that same argument 20 years later, and successfully, by the way. But there's been a number of evolutionists, of course, that have challenged this and said that Behe is wrong. Why? Because if we can show even one example of intelligent design, the evolutionists are out of business. Because now we can show that there is a creator, there is a designer, and a competing theory can better explain systems than the theory of evolution can. Okay, now, objections to the bacterial flagellum. Please try to stay in there because I want you to understand these, and then we'll show how these are easily and thoroughly refuted. Particularly, Kenneth Miller from Brown University have strongly rejected the flagellar motor as irreducible. He says, look, this can evolve. You can go on YouTube and watch what Dr. Miller says, but I'm going to rip it to shreds right now, so I don't know why you would want to do that. But if you would like to see that, go ahead. Miller objects on 3 grounds. If you watched the recent DVD that Michael Behe came out with, called the Revolutionary. You can get information on it on the internet. Just go ahead and go to YouTube and go Michael Behe Revolution, and you'll see places where you can order that. You can get it all day long on Amazon and other places. Miller objects on 3 grounds, and he actually brought this up at the trial in Dover in 2002. What Miller says, it fails to cite the imagination. You guys are just giving up. You're not doing the research. You're just going to come out and say, oh, God did it, okay? You're going to just say, you can't figure out how it evolved, so therefore God must have created it, and that's not science. So theorists cannot imagine how evolutionary mechanisms could have produced a certain species or structure, so they dismiss the possibility. But we have a clear understanding of evolutionary mechanisms, natural selection and mutation. These have been studied by science for many, many, many years, since the time of Darwin for natural selection, and certainly at least the last 50 or 60 years for mutations. No one has been able to imagine any evolutionary pathway for the development of the bacterial flagellum. They don't have a clue of how such a thing can occur. So my question for Dr. Miller was, how long do we have to wait for our imaginations to be able to explain this? Could that be hundreds of years, thousands of years? When would it be good enough, Dr. Miller? Now, Miller also objects. He says that this is the God of the gaps. Since no one can figure out how the flagellar motor arose, therefore cosmic design must have done it. Cosmic design. Notice that's in quotes. But Miller conveniently forgets that we see an irreducibly complex molecular machine requiring 40 different proteins to precisely order those individual characteristics in a precise sequence. That's how they grow, in a precise sequence, so that they function together as a unit. Intelligent design is not an argument from ignorance, but based on knowledge and observable influence. Okay? Now, let's go ahead and continue on. Number 3 is the most important one, because bacterial flagellum is said to not be irreducibly complex. According to Miller, he's argued that natural selection and mutation, the Darwinian mechanism, could have built the flagellar motor one step at a time. Miller has maintained that by taking a series of biological machines currently being used in systems, he calls that co-option, nature could have scavengerized parts from other existing systems, okay? So let's say you want to build a bicycle and you go into your garage and you find a spring, and you take the wheel off of your car, and you take a hammer and you bend it a certain way, and you cobble together through time some kind of parts that you already have, and that is made into the organism. And that's how Miller says it must have happened. Natural selection. It borrowed parts from other systems, put them together, and made them into that flagellar motor. However, what would cause the mindless scavengerizing of parts from other molecular machines? Natural selection has no intelligence. It can't think, oh, let me take this part over here, let me take that part over there, and put them together. Since natural selection has no end game, it has nothing in mind when it selects for a plan for the future. It has no idea of a plan for the future. An intelligent agent could do this, but not the Neo-Darwinian one. Evolution can't go into a garage and select parts to build a bicycle. The end game that intelligence has, it would never do that. And it can't work unless it's fully together. Okay, so you understand the analogy that natural selection could never cobble this together, because unless all the parts, 40 parts, are working together, it would never work or function as a unit. Miller argues that the type 3 secretory system, or better known as TTS, I'll just call it TTS, It's a microscopic syringe. That's what we can call it also, so you get the point. Microscopic syringe is an intermediate. He says, look, we can see how the bacterial flagella evolves because this microscopic syringe has 10 different proteins that are all similar to the bacterial flagellum. It could be the ancestor, or could it? Okay, so notice the number. He says there's 10 proteins in this particular organism, a microscopic syringe. What it does is it attaches to other organisms and drills a hole in there and essentially sucks out nutrients and so forth. And so he says this is an intermediate. That's where it comes from. It has 10 of the same proteins that the flagellular motor has, and so that shows you could evolve it from some other organism. Is that true? Okay, well, let's go to the next slide to find out. Again, the response to Miller. There are 40 parts, not 10, 40. You would have to put all these together just so. 30 of the proteins are not associated with that microscopic syringe. Only 10 of those parts. Where do the other 30 come from? They're not found in other systems. You have to have all 40 together at once, or you never get a flagellular motor that spins. And that microscopic syringe does not do the same thing as the flagellular motor. It never functions in the same way. It never looks like it or acts like it in any way. The additional 30 proteins then appear to be unique to the flagellular motor. Those additional 30 proteins would have been difficult to assembly. Again, you have to assemble them precisely cobble them together from other parts. But the other parts have to be worked on. If I take the wheel of a tire to use for my bicycle, it's not going to match up with a bicycle wheel. I have to modify that and work on it. And it would probably take far more work than buying it in the first place. And it might take me months just to get a similar type of wheel, but that would be with intelligence to get the bicycle wheel from the wheel of my car. Okay? Darwinists need an incredible evolutionary pathway with many steps documented for the flagella to evolve, and the sophisticated factory that builds them, but they don't have any of that. They don't have any idea, no documentation of how you do that. Miller's claim is like saying you can travel from LA to Japan. Why? Because, well, I've got the Hawaiian Islands in between. You see, that's an intermediate. Well, no, I don't think so. You'd probably drown if you tried to get from, LA to Tokyo or any place like that, Japan. You could not evolve that just because you have one step, the Hawaiian Islands, in the middle. You don't have all those intermediate forms, and the syringe doesn't appear to be related in the first place. Yes?
Also, the detail about the proteins that I suspect this Miller guy is neglecting. The protein can be stated as chemical composition or a certain sequence of things, but also there's the manner in which the protein is shaped. If a protein is a string, it's not just
that's right.
Spaghetti.
And those have to be bound in particular shapes.
Right. Okay. And so you might say, well, here are 10 proteins that are common to 10 proteins over there, and I think he's just talking chemical composition. He hasn't said anything about what the shapes of those proteins are.
Or the function. Or the function, yeah.
Okay, and so he's probably very much understating the whole nature of proteins just by saying this same thing was found here and here. Because the laboratory tests that detects a particular protein may talk about the composition, but typically does not say anything about the shaping in that context.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're right. You're absolutely right. And I have right now a friend who is a creationist, and he's in a PhD program. And his study, what he studies, is how proteins form. And not only do proteins have to have the right amino acid sequence in a polypeptide chain in order to function, but they have to be folded precisely correctly in order to function a certain way. And so there's all these special folds that they encounter. If you look at a protein, it's like folded up all very incredibly precisely designed. So there's a lot to this. So, an additional response to Miller. Good evidence provided by Dr. Scott Minnick argues that the microsyringe, that TTS system that Miller says is an intermediate, appears after the flagellum, not before it. So you say, well, how do we determine that? By looking at the number of mutations in an organism, you can see if it's been, how long it's been around. And so the syringe appears to be a devolutionary product rather than evolving, rather than the flagellum evolving from it, Bacterial Flagellum. It appears that, if anything, it's devolution, not evolution, that the flagellular motor appears to have been there before the syringe system. The TDS system, or the syringe system, has 10 of the needed proteins in the flagellum, but 40 are needed, and they must all be in precise order and function and folded precisely the right way. Michael Behe, has argued that this co-option model of things cobbling together, okay, will not work, because even if the other 30 proteins existed in other biological systems, which they really don't, they're not known to be, so they would have to be refitted from other systems that would have to have them precisely fitted from other functions. That cannot happen. They would have to be refitted. What or how are they refitted? It can't be natural selection, because natural selection has no end game. It has to be something that enhances the fitness of the organism. Well, these proteins from other systems can't enhance the flagellular motor until the flagellular motor functions as a whole. So there's no fitness involved there. You can't take something out of this system that's fit in that system and bring it over here before you have all 40 parts together, unless you want to argue all 40 parts evolved at one time, but that would be absurd. Therefore, they would have to be completely retooled or reshaped in advance. But there's no end game for natural selection, so that's not possible. Evolution has no plan in mind when it selects. So for 20 years now, evolutionists have tried to refute the design in the flagellular motor without success. And that's where it stands today. People like Kenneth Miller have not made their case. They have not demonstrated evolution. An irreducibly complex system in the flagellular motor still exists. Okay, now I have a lot more information. Do you want me to continue? No. You want me to stop?
Well, we're probably about at the drawing and the question-answer point.
You want to take a break, or I can just stop here? What would you folks like to do?
We might have to ask you back.
I think that's the way it's going.
There's so much more to this, and we're so sorry for all the technical difficulties. There is tremendous evidence here that complex systems do exist that show design. I only was able to give one example of the flagellular motor. And even, I'll wrap it up with this, even the arguments that strongly say that some things are bad design, and that's what the evolutionists argue. They say, well, we don't see any evidence of design, and not only that, we see evidence of bad design. Why would there be design at all? There wouldn't be, but bad design, and therefore things could not have and did not evolve. Did not and could not have been designed, but rather did evolve. Those examples are really bad. And so if I had more time, I would have shown you evidence that these supposed bad design examples are actually good design. And there's other irreducibly complex systems, many, many others that exist. Okay, so if you want to go ahead, I'll stop that with that.
Let's just do the drawing, right?
Okay. All right.
Okay, we